Welcome to The Impact Equation, conversations with leaders shaping a brighter future, with me, Adam Pike.
And me, Rafi Adelstein. With our special guests, we unlock the secrets of those who dare to transform our world. We talk to architects of change, pioneers in their fields, working towards a brighter future for us all. In each episode, we dig into each element of the impact equation. Today's guest is Tzeporah Berman, a trailblazing environmental activist. Tzeporah co-directed the International Climate and Energy Programme at Greenpeace and negotiated major policy victories like the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement and the Canadian Boreal Forest Initiative, which together protected over 40 million hectares of old-growth forests.
Tzeporah's journey began almost by accident in the early 90s when she was arrested during a highly controversial blockade in Canada's ancient rainforests. What has followed is a 30-year career of powerful environmental advocacy, now as International Programme Director at Stand.earth and Chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. For all this work, Tzeporah was recently named by Time magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential climate leaders in business in 2024, alongside the likes of Bill Gates, Jackson of Octopus, and Niels Christensen, CEO of Lego. Tzeporah, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So Tzeporah, you've had such a diverse career from fashion design to environmental advocacy. Could you walk us through your personal journey that led you to become an environmental activist?
Well, first of all, fashion design was a very long time ago. Now I'm showing my age, but I did start my university career in arts and in fashion design. That was 35 years ago or so. And it was actually during my first year of fashion arts design that I just started feeling like something was missing, that I needed to better understand the world. And I decided to go traveling. And actually it was that trip, I think it was 1989. I went to Europe, saved all my money and went to Europe. I really wanted to see art, art I'd been studying for years. And I had this, what I talk about in my book as one of these reckoning moments. I went to Athens, and at the time it was before a lot of the air pollution measures in Greece, and Athens was covered in like a thick yellow fog. And I can remember standing at the Acropolis looking down on the city, and it was just covered in yellow fog. And it was before the Acropolis had been restored. So it was just crumbling. And I went back to my hostel that night and I was coughing up black stuff. And I was just, I just realized how much I had taken for granted. I come from Canada. It's a big country with a lot of forest. And so I decided with my sister we would go hiking. We needed to get out in nature, and we picked a spot randomly on the map, and it was the Harz Mountains in Germany. And we were like, yes, lederhosen and beer and hiking, and off we went to the Harz Mountains. And what we didn't know is that part of the Harz Mountains had been left standing. It was a dead forest left standing as a testimony to acid rain. And so we hiked for an entire day through a standing dead forest, not the sound of a bird, not the sound of anything. And those 2 days, I got home just feeling so thankful. And like my eyes had been opened in a different way to the world. And, it was like once you have that lens, you see always through that lens. And I dropped out of fashion arts design and applied to University of Toronto to the environmental studies program. And that, I guess, really started me on my journey.
And what happened next then? So you applied to the program, you're at university. Talk us through.
My first year in that program, I remember being in a geography class, and the professor showed these forests, a picture of the ancient temperate rainforest, like trees that are 300 feet tall, 30-story office towers, and the largest living biomass on Earth. And I remember thinking, Brazil had a rainforest. I didn't even know Canada had a rainforest. And here I am in Canada. And so with the naivete of youth, I donned a backpack and saved all my money for a pair of hiking boots and a ticket to British Columbia. And I went out that summer and I didn't know anyone. And I backpacked around and volunteered at a local environmental group who was building trails into the middle of the rainforest to try and let people know what was happening. Anyways, I ended up falling in love with that forest and the people there, and actually falling in love. Actually, I met my husband on a logging blockade in the old growth rainforest on Vancouver Island.
Obviously, don't we all? That's how we all meet everybody.
I know. We named our first son Forrest, actually. I kid you not. Anyways, make a long story short, I ended up working there and volunteering there. And a couple of years later, the logging blockades really broke out and the local community was blockading, and I was supporting them. And I ended up becoming the one of the major spokespeople on that blockade. And by the end of the summer of 1993, I was charged with 857 criminal counts of aiding and abetting, and I faced 6 years in jail. I was 24. So that was a big awakening and a trial by fire in some ways. But yeah, that was a long time ago now, but that was the beginning of my journey.
Amazing. Tzeporah, I want to go back to that campaign and understand a bit more about it. But before we do, for many of our listeners, the rainforest is something somewhere very distant. And as you said, you lived in Canada and there was a rainforest on your doorstep, but you didn't appreciate it. Maybe at a philosophical level, before anything else, can you tell us why it matters, why it was so important to you?
Well, I think it was important to me on almost an emotional and spiritual level before I understood the science of why it's so important to us. Like the first time I entered into an old growth rainforest, a really ancient ecosystem, I'll never forget the feeling, how the air felt different and moist, how I felt so small. You barely come up to where the roots meet the beginning of the tree. You're just this tiny speck. And I was overwhelmed with the majesty of nature and the strength of it. And I'd never really seen anything like it. And the beauty and the richness. And the more, I was an academic. And so the more I started looking into it, the more I realized how rare that is now on our planet. Even back then, 80% of the world's intact forest had already been destroyed or degraded. Canada, Russia, and Brazil are really all that we have left for major areas of original forest that maintain ecosystem services. And now I know that those forests, those ecosystem services, the way that the Amazon controls our climate and hydrological cycles is absolutely essential because everything is connected. So protecting what's left of these strong and wild ecosystems are essential to our survival. I don't think I really understood that then. I didn't understand how rare these places are and how important it is to protect them. But I understood it on a kind of a deep personal level.
To take us into the campaign, what actually is a blockade? How does it work, and how did you survive it?
I didn't really know that either when I got there. And I had never been to a protest in my life. I just was so inspired by these people, these nurses and doctors standing in front of the bulldozers and getting hauled off, and I didn't know what to do. And so actually in my first year there in 1992, I cooked. I'm a good Jewish girl from Toronto. I know how to cook, and so I cooked through the camp and listened and learned and took some workshops. And by the second year, I was helping train people in how to be safe during a civil disobedience. And ultimately a blockade there's many different types, but it literally is just citizens standing up and saying no, saying this is not okay. We need to stop this, and forcing a rethinking, hopefully, if it's successful, by government and decision makers. And so these blockades were very peaceful. They were just citizens every morning standing across the road and saying no, and eventually they would get arrested and the logging would still happen. But it was so many people, so many stories of people going to jail. It really forced Canada to wake up and assess what was happening and created a massive debate. But actually, the blockades didn't end the logging. That's not what protected these rainforests. It started the controversy. But it was actually at the end of that summer, almost 1,000 people had been arrested. I was facing 6 years in jail, and the logging just continued. That forced me to really rethink how power is held and how social change is made. And it was in that campaign that I really started looking at, well, who are the decision makers? What do they care about? Where are these forests going? And I started connecting that local fight to trade, to policy. And I found out that 80% of everything logged was going to the US to make newspapers and yellow pages. There used to be these phone books because we had phone booths. That's how old I am. And catalogs and things like that. And so eventually we started talking to the customers. And that's when we really started building power. That's when the companies and the government started listening to us. It was a combination, I would say, and which I think it always is now, 30 years later, of every campaign that I run. There's no one silver bullet. There's no one thing that forces a decision maker to act and change. And in this case, the blockades kind of started the debate, but then there was, of course, the research and the reports and the policy work, and then there was the customer work. And eventually, big customers like Scott Paper in the UK and Home Depot and others canceled their contracts unless the government protected more rainforest and changed its logging practices. And that was really the beginning of the pathway towards solutions and negotiations with the companies and the government to protect those rainforests.
Incredible. Tzeporah, it sounds like there's a strong interplay between grassroots activism and, I guess, governmental leverage and then commercial leverage too. In for a campaign like the Non-Proliferation work with the Fossil Fuel Treaty, how do you see those different facets interacting with one another? How do you exert influence and insert, I guess, authority in those dynamics?
This campaign for a fossil fuel treaty is literally built on that analysis. If we're going to stop the expansion of oil, gas, and coal, which is what is creating the extreme weather, the fires, and the floods around the world, the interesting thing when I started working on fossil fuels and climate change that I learned, especially now, is that we have the technology to make the changes we need to make. I mean, last year, the IEA said we could use 50% less oil, gas, and coal on the planet by 2030, just with existing technologies and systems. We can move to a renewable energy and cleaner and safer future, but there's a lot of people making a lot of money still off fossil fuels. And those companies, literally the most powerful companies and most profitable companies in the history of the planet. I mean, the oil and gas industry has made $2.8 billion a day in pure profit every day for the last 50 years. And so they have this tremendous influence over governments and policy. So if we're going to get governments to actually take a stand like Colombia has done, or many of the other 14 countries that have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty, and say, look, we need to stop expanding oil, gas, and coal, we need a different and cleaner future, then they need to know that there is support. So we have to build political space and social license by increasing the number of people and the amount that people talk about it, the amount of support that this idea has. So when I first launched the Fossil Fuel Treaty, we initially approached Nobel laureates, thinking that, governments are going to need to have a foundation of support from people like Nobel laureates, from scientists. Within a couple of months after explaining the idea to them, 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, had endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. Then we moved to talking to scientists. We now have 3,000 scientists around the world, all the major climate scientists in the world, who have endorsed the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. And then we moved to cities, and that's still running. Cities all over the world, from Calcutta to LA to New York, all over the world have now started passing motions at city councils, calling on their governments to support a fossil fuel treaty, international cooperation to stop expansion of fossil fuels. So that campaign, built from the grassroots, getting more and more and more and more support, convinces governments that, because even if they know it's the right thing from a scientific perspective, often they'll be worried about sticking their neck out because they've got to get voted back in again in the next election. So this is about building power and building political space and simultaneously building the ideas that work, that will show a benefit to them. So we have at the Fossil Fuel Treaty a whole research arm that looks at trade agreements and tax agreements and debt agreements that will help governments create the preconditions necessary to stop expanding fossil fuels. Because there are some governments like, Ecuador, drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. And so how do you support those kind of countries? Or Malaysia, where over 60% of their GDP functions on revenues from fossil fuel exports. If they're actually going to stop expanding the problem that we know is killing us, and I know that sounds dramatic, but we see and know that fossil fuels are today's weapons of mass destruction. We know we can replace them, and we know their use is literally killing people, not just from climate change and extreme weather, which it is. 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today causing climate change come from three products: oil, gas, and coal, but also because of their health impacts. So almost 9 million people died last year just from air pollution from climate change alone.
And Tzeporah, just to track back slightly, could you share with us the genesis of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, where it came from and what your original objectives were, and how it has snowballed from there?
Well, I started working on climate change about 20 years ago. I shifted from forest conservation and the trade of wood and paper products to climate change because I realized that most of the forests that I had spent my adult life trying to protect were now going up in smoke. They were burning or getting eaten by beetle infestations. And that forced me to really look at the science of climate change. And I started understanding the systemic causes, fossil fuels, and exploring that. Well, Canada has one of the largest, single largest industrial project on Earth, which is the tar sands in Canada. And this is a very heavy carbon intensive oil project. And also the majority of Canada's rise in emissions comes from the oil sands. And so I started working there in trying to convince my own government to address this issue. And it was in the tar sands. I was actually appointed by the Alberta government to co-chair the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group with the former CEO of Shell and Indigenous nations. And what I realized there is even if you get a progressive administration, like the Trudeau government came into power, they believe in climate change. They were hiring a lot of scientists and friends I know to do their climate policy. They only see themselves as responsible for reducing emissions and pollution, whereas production can just continue to rise because that has not been seen as part of climate policy for 30 years. And I think it's no mistake that the actual products have been invisible in climate policy. I think that was a plan by the fossil fuel industry. Make us feel guilty for our use, talk about the demand, and they're just producing to serve demand. But what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. And it just struck me in that experience that, no, we need countries to be constraining their production in line with Paris goals, not just their emissions. That's why we keep missing emissions targets. So I started looking around the world to understand what countries were actually doing this right, where fossil fuels are expanding, the US, Norway, Argentina, Ecuador, Brazil, Nigeria. I started approaching academics and activists from all over the world and policymakers, and I realized that the global system and national policy was entirely designed the same. I'll never forget the day I searched the Paris Agreement for the words fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and found out those words don't even exist in the world's international climate agreement. So for me, that's where this grew out of, recognizing that we needed a framework, a companion to the Paris Agreement to constrain the production of fossil fuels. And then when I started doing the research, I realized that Pacific Island nations, who of course have been at the forefront of climate leadership for decades. I mean, the International Court of Justice, we wouldn't have that addressing climate change if it wasn't for Pacific Islands, loss and damage, the term and the concept, the commitment to 1.5 in the Paris Agreement. These are the most vulnerable nations on Earth who have really shown that leadership and pushed those issues. And in 2016, they proposed the Suva Declaration, which was the first call for a moratorium on fossil fuel production. And so I started studying that and then convened a group of academics, and a couple of academics had already come up with the idea, looking at nuclear non-proliferation. What if we had fossil fuel non-proliferation? Stop the stockpiling and expansion and just manage a wind down of the existing production. And I contacted those academics, and in the beginning, a lot of people thought I was crazy and I couldn't get any funders to agree to fund this work. And then I won the Climate Breakthrough Award in 2019, where they give you several $1 million to explore a breakthrough climate strategy. And, I felt like George Clooney in Ocean's 11. I kept joking around that it was my Climate 11. All of a sudden, I had millions of dollars in this idea. And I was like, okay, I need the world's best climate communicator. I need this diplomat. I need this lawyer. And I just put together a steering committee and started going. And now here we are, I guess, almost 5 years since then. And the campaign's active in over 50 countries around the world. We have, I think, 3,800 organizations that have endorsed now in 117 countries.
Yeah.
There are new countries joining every day. It's really picked up.
What is fascinating is that it appears that you've gone from statements and policy to grassroots activism to movement making and impact making. So could you talk us through a bit more the journey from these statements and policy work and research to building a movement that crosses continents?
First of all, what's critical is, I think, transparency and being responsible and adaptive to a movement. A lot of people talk about movement building, but what they're really doing is taking an idea or a concept and getting sign on, like trying to go to people and saying, here's our idea, work on it. And sometimes that works to a certain extent. But what we've tried to do is build the framework and the idea from the ground up. So we didn't come with a treaty. Here's the treaty. Do you want to support it? Do you want to sign it? We came with an idea. And the first thing that we did is start to develop the principles behind the idea. So we're looking for a treaty that's based on justice and equity, that stops the expansion of fossil fuels. So the principles were based on science, they were based on justice, and then we started doing consultations with the biggest climate groups around the world, then with health organizations, with faith organizations that had run the divestment work. We're now working with indigenous nations, trying to understand how indigenous knowledge and law can inform the treaty. And so in doing this, as we started doing those conversations and developing the foundation for the work, we also shifted. We shifted how we see the treaty, what the treaty will include. And we're still doing that. We're building the framework from the ground up. And as groups started supporting the idea and said, well, this is my idea of how I'd like to work on it. We really have a mantra inside the Secretariat of the Fossil Fuel Treaty that our job is to say yes and let go. And that's not easy to do when it's your campaign or your idea, or, you've got this.
Sure, baby.
Often people hold really tight. That's not a movement. And so, we'll often get these debates internally. Well, this person endorsed it. I don't know if I like them, and they're what they're doing, blah, blah. Okay, well, we're a diverse movement. We're a big tent. They're going to take it in their direction. No one owns the idea of a fossil fuel treaty, and the journey matters. The more diverse voices that join and start talking about it in their way, like the way you talk about the phase out of fossil fuels in Nigeria. It's going to be very different from the way you talk about the phase out of fossil fuels in the UK, for example. Different pressures. This is about development. It's about energy poverty. It's about access to energy. It's very different than issues in the UK, which might be affordability or energy security, et cetera. And so we really have to empower people on the ground to take it where they need to take it. And that's not always easy. I mean, at the last climate change negotiations in Baku, Azerbaijan, Dr. Andrew Forrest endorsed the treaty and joined the campaign. This is a billionaire from Australia who made his billions in mining. You can imagine some of the grassroots activists who work on treaty, how they felt about that. But many of our countries who have endorsed, especially, Colombia, Pacific Island nations, they said, great, we need more businesses on board. We need more billionaires on board to support us. That's fine. Welcome him. So it's, if you have a true movement, it's going to be work. There's going to be disagreements. And I think just like in nature, we're stronger with our diversity.
So tell us about the pushbacks you do get. So presumably we need dense energy now. The IEA projections call on fossil fuels running for another couple of decades, and we can't put that at risk, and security. I presume there's we can't get it all done now objection, or why are you going around the typical traditional diplomatic route? Like, what pushback do you tend to get, and from where?
Well, there's a lot of pushback, of course, because there's still a lot of money to be made in fossil fuels, and because the fossil fuel industry has spent decades fear-mongering about price, about scarcity. If you constrain us, you're all going to shiver in the dark. It's going to be too expensive to heat your homes. And these ads run daily still. I see them in Canada all the time. And so people are afraid. And so I think the first pushback is, the fear around scarcity, affordability, and price. The facts are in our favor. Renewables are now cheaper at scale than fossil fuels. They are cleaner. And when you add in the related costs, the liability, the oil spills, the toxic water, the health concerns, and even extreme weather. I mean, the new report came out last month saying that we are spending $16.3 million an hour right now just to deal with extreme weather. And so we have a lot of the facts in our favor, but we have decades of, I think, false advertising and almost like peacetime propaganda, I call it, that kind of extorts the way people are thinking, distorts the way people are thinking. And so that's part of it. Is we have to talk through the reality The second is we also have to really reinforce, we're not saying turn off the taps overnight. If you look at how much oil, gas, and coal we already have on the surface of the planet and how much is under construction, we have enough. We have enough fossil fuels to use during the transition to net zero and beyond without expanding production. So we're not saying stop production. We're saying stop expanding production. And let's use what we have carefully based on principles of equity and justice. So if there is drilling happening in the UK and drilling happening in Ecuador, how quickly do they decline? When do they stop production? That timeline needs to be negotiated between countries because we have a definitive carbon budget. Right now, the market gets to decide how much fossil fuels are produced. And so the result is we're on track right now to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal than the world can ever burn if we want to stay below 2 degrees. And that's by 2030. Mm-hmm. So we're just producing more and more and more, which is such a waste of money if we know that we can't actually even burn it unless we want a completely unstable climate.
Looking ahead at the scale of your ambition, what are you hoping to achieve and how are you going about achieving it?
Well, when we studied 6 other treaties, what we found is that there's 2 kind of big political pathways. One is a treaty like you have with the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, 190 countries by consensus, non-binding. And then there are lots of other treaties, chemical weapons bans, landmines, where they were developed by a small group of countries. It's more of like a build it and they will come model. A small group of countries with really high ambition. And then they created rules and agreements that started to become the social norm in foreign policy. Even countries that never signed the landmines or chemical weapons ban or nuclear non-proliferation agreements started abiding by those rules because that was what was acceptable. That's what we need to do. We need to shift the social norm of how fossil fuel expansion is seen. So you can't have the UK or Canada saying we're climate leaders while expanding new drilling. Australia doing new coal plants while saying it's a climate leader. We have to shift that. So fossil fuel production is seen as not okay. It's elephants for ivory. And we're starting to do that. I mean, our first campaign in Glasgow was it's time to say the F words at COP, just to force people to note that we actually weren't even talking about fossil fuels. Now, if you fast forward a couple of years later, we already have fossil fuel phase out agreed to in the Dubai Agreement and in New York at this September at the Summit for the Future at the UN. We're building the group of countries that have endorsed the treaty. So next step is that group of countries expands to include countries in each region of the world, which we are close to. I believe in the next coming months, we are going to see countries from Asia and Africa join the bloc of nations. Once we have a more representative group, probably around 20 countries, and we're around 14 now, then that bloc of countries will actually formally start negotiations. They don't have to do that through United Nations General Assembly resolution or a UNEA resolution. They can actually do that just by hosting their own meeting. The Ottawa Convention was a conference that was hosted by Ottawa on chemical weapons bans. That was the creation of the beginning of the chemical weapons ban negotiations. So we're likely looking that route where in the next year negotiations will start, hosted by a country, and as the mechanisms are discussed, market access mechanisms, for example, countries that have committed to the fossil fuel treaty will say, we're still buying some oil and gas and coal. We're only going to buy from other fossil fuel treaty countries. Those kinds of mechanisms create carrots and sticks that more countries want to join. So I think the campaign will continue to take off. We've just started a champions initiative where we have artists and celebrities from around the world. We've started a music and arts initiative. We have Pacific artists, amazing artists from the Pacific Islands called This Is Our Home. And they have started a band to raise awareness around the world on the fossil fuel treaty. And they are so good. They got picked up by Coldplay and they just played on the stage in New Zealand with Coldplay. And next year they'll be touring around the world. So we have an arts and culture initiative, a cities initiative. That's expanding to states. California has now endorsed at the Senate and the House. So we'll have more states joining. So the campaign will continue to grow. And meanwhile, the negotiations will begin and we'll start looking at these mechanisms. And we believe within a couple of years, we could have a companion to the Paris Agreement that will help to stop the expansion of fossil fuels all over the planet.
What is that tipping point, Tzeporah, that you're working towards?
Well, there's not one. I think there are many. The first is enough countries that they feel secure to start the negotiations. So we think based on other treaties, that's going to mean countries from each region of the world. And probably at least one big consuming country. We don't have a European country yet, for example, so that will be important in the block of nations. That will be a big tipping point to start the negotiations. The other tipping point is when we have a couple of more mid-level producing countries saying they're willing to stop expansion. So it was a big tipping point last year when Colombia joined the block of nations. Colombia is the 6th largest coal exporter in the world. And they have now joined the fossil fuel treaty. And when President Petro joined, he said, look, we know every day we're making the problem worse. And we know we can't stop. We can't do it alone unless we have international cooperation. And that's why we need the fossil fuel treaty. And so now there are more countries who are in the position of expanding fossil fuels, who are looking at the treaty. I think that will be a significant tipping point for the issue. And really the biggest tipping point will be when one of the fossil fuel 5, as I call them, joins. So Canada, the US, UK, Norway, and Australia, these 5 countries are responsible for the majority of fossil fuel expansion, oil, gas, and coal expansion on the planet right now and in the foreseeable future. And they're the wealthiest countries.
Why are those 5? So why is the UK one of the big 5?
Now, the UK is a very interesting example because with this government, that may shift, as we all know. And I think the fact that the government has said that they won't challenge the Rosebank court case is an interesting sign about what they're thinking. So, we'll see what the UK does. But that's just based on pure numbers of who's producing what on the planet and who plans to produce what is in existing fields.
As you're trying to work towards getting the UK, for example, to sign up, what's your approach? Is it direct to politicians? Is it a combination of that and the grassroots? What's the process?
It's both. We meet with a lot of governments. And recently our new president, Kumi Nadu, the well-known human rights activist from South Africa, he used to be the Secretary General of Amnesty. And before that, he was the Executive Director of Greenpeace International. He's joined the Fossil Fuel Treaty as president. And when he came on board last month, he sent a letter to all world leaders, individually, presidents and prime ministers around the world, asking them to meet and talking about the fossil fuel treaty. A lot of them have already responded. So we have meetings now around the world with governments. We also meet with civil society groups, and the campaign pops up where there is energy. There's quite a lot of groups in the UK. We already have the largest union in the UK who has joined. The City of London has already joined. There's a lot, the campaign in the UK is quite big. There's a big campaign in Ireland, Fossil Free Ireland, that has launched. And so a lot of the campaign work will grow, and that will really create space and new immediate interest and awareness about the need for a fossil fuel treaty. And we'll simultaneously be meeting with governments and see where it goes. We're growing as fast as we can.
Tzeporah, in the UK, there have been a number of public protests, such as those led by Extinction Rebellion. And a lot of criticism has been directed at them for disrupting ordinary people's lives. What's your view on the place of protest, peaceful protest, given the stakes here?
I think that history will see those people who are willing to disrupt everyday life, to raise awareness about the climate emergency as heroes, not criminals. I think it is absolutely necessary. And I understand that sometimes it can be frustrating. And I think it's really important that those protests be safe. We have to make sure that people who need to get to hospital, all those kinds of things. But if our daily life is disrupted by protests that are raising awareness of what we're facing, then good. Some people say to me, but when, these protests, A22 and the Just Stop Oil, all these things, they make me uncomfortable. Good. Our job is not at this moment in history to make people comfortable. Our job is to protect life and living systems. And there is so much that turns us away from climate change because it seems too big, because we feel guilty, we still use fossil fuels, because our elected officials are not acting like the house is on fire. And so psychologically, when we see people just going about their normal lives, then we think, oh, must not be so bad. And then we don't engage in the issues. If we don't engage in these issues right now, then our children and our grandchildren's lives will be entirely different. That's the choice we have today. Every ton of carbon matters.
I think that's absolutely right.
Every ton of carbon right now that we stop from putting in the atmosphere, every ton of carbon that we stop from putting in the atmosphere will save lives. And that's, I think, what we need to hold on to.
I don't think people get that at all. I really don't. I mean, I work in the space and we talk about it every day, and it's sort of, there's this weird cognitive dissonance between engaging professionally on sustainability and then looking out into the world of what the debate is, what the state of the debate is in society, what politicians talk about, and the sort of the discrepancy between the urgency and the scale of the problem versus the limited airtime that's given to it is just crazy. People don't really understand the sort of urgency and the scale of the challenge that we face. So all power to you and what you're doing, Tzeporah, like, from
all
us
power to all
you.
of us, frankly.
Yeah,
to all of us.
to all
Exactly.
of us.
No, people often come up to me and say, thank you so much for what you're doing. What can I do? And I say, make it your own.
Yeah.
Do whatever you can. Get up every morning and say, what am I going to do? Someone the other day asked me, like, how do you stay hopeful, and how do you still have hope? And I said, I love the author Rebecca Solnit. She writes in the Guardian, has written many, many wonderful books. And she says, hope isn't like a lottery ticket that you get to sit on the couch and hold. Hope is something that you make every day with your actions. Hope is a responsibility that we have to get up every day and say, what am I going to do? What's in my power to do?
So Tzeporah, thank you so much for the time. We really enjoyed hearing all about the treaty. Tell us what's next. So you're trying to get more countries on board and signed up. You're running up to 2030 for the treaty. What does the future look like for you and your activism?
One of the things I love about working on the fossil fuel treaty is every day I open the computer and I don't know what to expect. Some of the world's leading faith organizations and faith leaders, a cardinal from the Vatican, have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. And the next day it's moms from across India, and then it's doctors from across. It's so exciting. We need the momentum and hope. So I would encourage people to follow us at fossilfueltreaty.org, to join us, to create their own events. I think this movement is going to grow, and I think we're going to see more countries join. I think we're going to start to see it become more populist, not just a policy prescription. But look, this isn't just about fossil fuels. This is about protecting what we love. And I think we're looking at launching a very public campaign that more people will join, because we're going to frame it around like, look, what do you love? Tell us what you love, and let's protect that together.
Amazing.
And so I hope we can grow the campaign, and that's what you'll see in the future. And I hope more people join us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Tzeporah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And just know, I know a lot of your listeners are businesses, so I just wanted to add, we have an incredible business program at the Fossil Fuel Treaty. This year, 25 banks have joined and endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and now more and more companies are signing on. And so whether you're an organization or a company or an individual, there is something you can do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Adam, reactions to that conversation with Tzeporah?
I thoroughly enjoyed it. What for me was most interesting was how Tzeporah has gone from problem to policy statement to research, academia, and bringing together all of those stakeholders into her effectively a broad tent coalition, and how she's managed to grow it from Canada to countries all over the world, to the point of getting, I think it was Colombia, she said, signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So for me, the thing that I find particularly interesting is how she's created a movement out of this program.
Well done for saying non-proliferation properly. I can't quite handle that. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty,
Good.
that she's set up and is running, it's incredible. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing that we need to see. Global, grassroots and policy-led initiative that is really demonstrating something relatively simple, which is ending new production, but which isn't happening today. It wasn't even mentioned around the COP table. The words fossil fuels, the F words, were not on the table until she started to really push that message. So she's really a pioneer in this vitally important space. It's amazing that we had her on. As someone that's not so, involved in the climate space, Adam, how did it come across to you, sort of her message of, the need to act and the sort of urgency of the problem?
I find it, again, it's like a mirror being held up against me. And I don't quite like what I see in terms of the decisions that I make on a day-by-day basis. I don't really consciously decide about my consumer habits that much, although more recently that's started to change. For me, I particularly appreciated her very frank pushback on people who are frustrated by, I guess, the disruption caused by protests in England, because as Tzeporah says, if they don't stand up to people and protect the climate, then who will? So for me, it's, again, I think you have to confront decisions that I take on a day-by-day basis, and my family takes on a day-by-day basis, because I'm absolutely still part of the problem.
I think that's right. And I think Tzeporah, she represents kind of the old guard in a way of climate sustainability activism. She talked about what she did in terms of the blockade for logging in Canada 30 years ago or so. And she's grown up in this movement, in this space. And she's like, even though she talks about how she came to it after numerous degrees and other topics, she's part of that world. And in a way, what we need is to take the message that she's crystallized over that time and over that years to become the leading activist that she's become, and make it the norm in wider society and wider culture. I think that's what's happening in this treaty. She talked about it being a force of arts and culture. It talked about cities, companies, it really being a broad-based movement.
Every level.
And that is what we need to see, is that translation of, sustainability and climate as a niche sport for the tree huggers, which I think Tzeporah already was at one point, to being really on the mainstream conversation. I think that's where we got to in the discussion, a bit about the political failings that we've seen this last year of big elections of, climate net zero is kind of there, but in some ways it's more of a dividing line than it is a sort of a global core.
Uniting line.
Exactly. And a driving force of what the political sphere needs to solve for. And, it's not everything's about politics, but I think she's really driving at that problem.
Amazing. Well, great. Good to see you, Rafi.
Until next time on The Impact Equation.